Brooks of Sports by Brooks, Brooks Melchior in Los Angeles. Every weekday, 9 noon Eastern time. We're in LA, obviously. We're going to be talking Pac-12 here in a second with John Wilner. Wilner Hotline on Twitter, mercurynews.com. I highly suggest if you're going to pay any money for anything in sports media and you care about football, John Wilner, subscribing to mercurynews.com, it's a no-brainer. It's right there with The Athletic. I mean, those are things you can't do without if you're a college football fan. So we're going to go through the Pac-12 with John, with the coaching situations, UW. We've got SC, of course. Nobody's better. I want to talk to him about some other things, though. Huge day today, really, for Utah and the Pac-12 with the college football playoff rankings coming out. Huge. And so we're going to talk about that. Later in the show, we're going to talk Florida State with Deshaun Reed of The Athletic, friend of the show. And so is John. They've been on the show before. Deshaun Reed, beat writer for The Athletics, Florida State Seminoles beat. So we're going to go down to Florida, talk to him, and get an update on what's going on at Florida State. Then we'll have Dan Orlovsky on to talk some NFL, talk quarterbacks, ask him some questions about quarterbacks, some burning questions. That's coming up in the next hour, Dan Orlovsky. But first, I want to bring in, and I'm going to have some things for you coming up myself later on in the show. So stay tuned for that. But first, let's bring in John Wilner from mercurynews.com, the Wilner Hotline on Twitter, as good as it gets when it comes to covering college football. Hey, John, how you doing?
I am good, Brooks. How about yourself?
I'm like you. I'm going crazy right now. There's so many things going on. And you're doing it. First of all, you're doing a great job, by the way. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I was just going to say, quite the start yesterday to December.
Yeah, it is. And this is, you can make the argument, certainly this is the most interesting time of the year because you have the overlap of the college football playoffs. We don't know what's going to happen there. You got the coaching stuff starting to blow up. But the first thing I want to touch on before we get into the coaching stuff is, and I want to talk about the college football playoffs and the implications for Utah. I mean, what are your thoughts? Kind of set the scene going into tonight. What's going to happen? What do you think is going to happen? And what could it mean for the Pac-12 based on what happens to Utah in the playoff rankings?
Well, they've been doing these rankings now since early November, basically to fill airtime for ESPN, right? Because it doesn't really matter till now. But this is the first rankings that really, I think, is going to have an impact. If Oklahoma jumps Utah, then Utah loses some control of its own destiny, you would think.
Yep.
Hard to imagine they're going to elevate Oklahoma today and then elevate Utah over Oklahoma if the Sooners win on Saturday. So I think it's going to be crucial. Do they think that Oklahoma's victory over Oklahoma State on the road, impressive performance, their defense looked good, which had been the committee's question about Oklahoma. Is that enough to get them over Utah? If it's not, Utah's probably in decent shape with a solid win on Friday night. If Oklahoma jumps them, I think then the Pac-12 is going to be in trouble and is going to be rooting like hell for Baylor.
Do you think that there's any way that the Pac-12 or the Big Ten or whomever, because of course the Big Ten is not part of this conversation outside of Ohio State and hasn't been for some time, and they've been pushing. Do you think that there's any way we could see an expansion of the playoff because we're having these kinds of stupid conversations? To me, I mean, Utah should be in, Oklahoma should be in. It's ridiculous. But do you think that that's a possibility we may see an expansion, or do you think this is just ESPN if they're going to write a check or they're not? That's what's going to determine whether we expand.
I think that there will be expansion, but not
Really?
till the current contract ends. Yeah, I think we're going to get through 2026. There is so little push at the higher level, the management committee level, that it's a long, they can't just decide in January that the next year they're changing, right?
And it's a TV contract, you're saying. That's what
TV contract, and there's a lot of logistics in terms of stadiums. And also, if they do expand, how are they going to fit that other round in, that third round of games? Where does that game set fall? Does it fall this weekend and replace the conference championships? Do they slot it in the middle of December after final exams? Problem there is a lot of, campuses are empty.
Right.
Do they slot it in early January and have it essentially take over what the New Year's bowls are right now? So they don't know where to put that game. And that's just one of the many logistical issues that they've got to solve, which is why I think that we're going to get to 2026 with the current format. Then when there's a new TV contract, they will have an 18 playoff. And by then they'll have figured out how to squeeze that quarterfinal round in somewhere.
Boy, it's interesting. You just made me think of something I hadn't thought of. Forget about the SEC in the context of this conversation and most of the other conferences. And if a team is in that college football playoff mix, let's say in the top 8, and the campus is empty because of final exams, normally in the SEC, it's not an issue. And in most of but in the Pac-12, you could theoretically have, I don't know what school, we could pick on a school, but there are schools, well, they'll remain nameless, but
Sure.
There are schools, or I'm asking you, do you think there are schools in the Pac-12 where if we expanded and you had a home game in your first college football playoff game, that we could see some half empty stadiums in the Pac-12?
Well, I mean, it would be tough. Some of the places that have significant student sections, if you've got that playoff, and just kind of picking the random dates. Yeah. If you've got a playoff, say Saturday, December 16th or 17th, and school's been out, there could be some empty seats. I don't think there'll be a ton of empty seats, but there could be some. Yeah. But the issue is, and that's a presidential and chancellor level decision, not only in the Pac-12, but everywhere. Do they want to have a gigantic on-campus event 8-10 days before Christmas?
Right.
Because that's putting stress on a lot of facets of your campus community. And I don't know that the presidents would want to do that. So it would make more sense for them to have the quarterfinal round basically this coming weekend. But then you're getting rid of conference championships. Right. And I sure don't think the SEC wants to get rid of their conference championship game.
It's a lot of money. We're visiting.
A lot of money.
We're visiting with John Wilner, Wilner Hotline on Twitter, mercurynews.com. If ever there was a reason to spend money on content, I mean, I've got mercurynews.com. In my credit card, it's save the credit card number and all that stuff. You're locked in. The Athletics locked in. Big time. You got to have it. John Wilner is the entire Pac-12. He's the Oracle, as I call him. And we're talking about things that I hadn't even thought about. But when this is really fascinating. And here's my thought on it. When it comes to college football or college football factory presidents, the guys at Ohio State, the guys at all of those schools in the SEC, Alabama, you name it. But an example would be particularly like Texas A&M. The fact that Texas and Texas A&M are no longer playing, which is amazing. And I grew up in Kansas City. Kansas and Missouri are no longer playing. The reason they're no longer playing is somebody wrote a check. And so when we're talking, I think that's kind of supersedes the whole conversation. If UCLA or Arizona or Oregon State, not saying that would happen, but if UCLA made the college football playoff, just to spell it out, let's say they made the college football playoff and they had a home game in the third week of December, let's say, or second week of December. I think there's a very, very, very good chance that you could have a lot of empty seats, potentially at the Rose Bowl. So I guess that's what we're really talking about. But my thought on it is, if they wrote a big enough check, they're going to do it. I mean, what do you think?
I think that that's probably the case. And especially if you consider the legislative backdrop that is unfolding right now with pay to play, right? Mm-hmm. So if all of a sudden everything
that slippery slope
is elevated, the schools aren't going to pay the recruits, but certainly the competition for recruits is going to increase. Facilities, coaching staffs,
arms race.
Arms race is just everything is going to get more intense. Budgets are going to skyrocket. There is no stopping the cost of doing business in major college football, and you're putting that game in the middle of December, and it's not only about the home team fans, but it's also you're gonna put a lot of stress on the road teams fans. Is somebody going to want to pay airfare and hotel to go across the country in the middle of December to watch their team when they have holiday bills coming up, when they may have gone to their conference championship game and when they may be saving up for a semifinal, plane ticket. So there's just,
and their lives don't revolve around college football. Some places they do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. I cut you off.
No, I just think that there's the logistical component is daunting when you're talking about this third week of games. Yeah. It makes it much more complicated than the change from BCS to 14 playoff, because you had the major bowls right there sitting as your semifinals, and you have a Monday in January. But now you got a third week, and you got to find time and campus availability for that, or you've got to bump the conference championship games out.
It's amazing, because the fact that we're having this conversation, I'm sure it's a disconnect for people that are watching right now, and we've got people in SEC country that watch the show, and in the South, and I went to the University of Georgia, and they can't even conceptualize, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Of course they're going to fill a stadium. Of course it's not a problem. It is a problem in the Pac-12, potentially. And, college football is reaping what it sowed when you have this limited situation and you take away, it's out of sight, out of mind if you're a Cal fan, or this year if you're a Stanford fan or an Arizona fan. You're reaping what you sow, even when you put those teams into the mix on a consistent basis, because for so long, people haven't had that mentality out here, except for maybe USC fans, Washington fans, maybe that's about it. Speaking of Washington, fascinating situation. It really is fascinating when you look at what's going on at Washington. Quick thoughts from me on this before I get your thoughts. I've been saying all year that Washington, to me, Chris Peterson has not really broken through to the elite level, the very, 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 very top. Certainly he's done a great job. I'm not saying he hasn't. And in a sense, he's really done a great job in that he's really stabilized that program and brought it back up to the level where Washington people expected it to be for a long time, and it hadn't been. A little bit like USC a few years ago, right? Up until now, USC fans, the programs, they're winning games, but it's not where they want it. And it was kind of similar at UW. Peterson has brought that back. But now, this reminds me of Bob Stoops. Is it fair to compare this to Bob Stoops and Lincoln Riley and Jimmy Lake and Peterson?
I think in just the succession plan, absolutely. Even Ohio State a little bit. We're seeing these high-level coaches burning out when they're still in their 50s. Part of the reason they're so successful is that they have made good hires on the coordinator front. And so they do have a candidate waiting there. I think that it's probably the reason Jimmy Lake turned down the Alabama defensive coordinator post last winter. It makes perfect sense to me. It's like Peterson's greatest trick play, right? It is something none of us saw coming, but it was immaculately planned. And he's got the guy right there. Lake was an obvious candidate, and everything should, if as transitions go, it should be as smooth as they could have hoped.
Yeah, I in the back of my mind, it really is almost exactly like Stoops. My thought process is it because he can't? Does Chris Peterson say to it? Is he sitting at the edge of the bed in the last year or last couple of years and saying to himself, God, we're a good team. We're at that top level, but we're not at that elite level. And I'm not so sure I want to turn myself into Urban Meyer, let's say, and go 24/7 to get us into that playoff every year. Could that be a part of that thought process, that he just doesn't want to go crazy, or is there something else at work there with Peterson?
I think that's a lot too. That's a lot of it. I don't know necessarily that he is thinking in his head, palpably thinking, to get to the playoff, I've got to work X number more hours a week. I think it's just the general grind. He's clearly a little.
You got the transfer portal. He's been a guy who's been a big critic of that kind of stuff, right?
Oh, absolutely. And just the pay to play, the recruiting, the social media. All these things combine to make it more difficult, more intense for the coaches.
He's like a Dabo light. Peterson is, right? wouldn't you say?
He
Dabo's
a
complained about that stuff too.
Yeah.
But Dabo, I think, is willing to pay the price. Hey, let's get a miniature golf course over here.
Right. Right. No,
I mean,
yeah.
he's willing to walk the walk, where I don't think Chris really wanted to get to. Maybe I don't
No,
know him, so
I don't think he does want to walk that walk. And
right.
the fact that he stayed at Boise as long as he did and turned down jobs, that some really high profile jobs, and waited and then went to Seattle, from Boise to Seattle, that tells you a lot about him and his priorities, right? I mean, you could say, what would Chris Peterson be like in Norman or Columbus or Tuscaloosa? That's kind of not him. He's a little bit different. And so this kind of fits. If you had told me a year or two ago, Chris Peterson is not going to make it past 55, I wouldn't have been that surprised because of the burnout. I just wouldn't have known that it was coming now and it was coming in this manner. That's the surprising element.
I want to talk about Jimmy Lake in a second, but we're visiting with John Wilner, mercurynews.com, Wilner Hotline on Twitter. And I think about Urban Meyer, and I talked to a source a while ago, and he mentioned Urban Meyer. He knows Urban Meyer, and I've been talking to him about the future. And Urban Meyer had invoked Mac Brown and what's going on at North Carolina right now. And so I think this may be the future of college football coaches in this kind of a position where, personally, I think the next landing spot for Urban Meyer is going to be either Notre Dame or Ohio State, possibly. That's in the back of my mind. I talked to a lot of people. I used to work in Columbus, used to work with Ohio State, got some sources. That's my sense. He doesn't want the USC job. That's a whole nother dynamic we're going to talk about here in a second. I really want to get your thoughts on that. But in terms of when it comes to these coaches like a Peterson, maybe he comes back at some point. Who knows? I think that's something you can't rule out. But, man, he is stepping in a way at a very, very early age. But when I remember over the last couple of years, John, talking to sources about Jimmy Lake in terms of head coaching jobs. And I found this is in the last 2 years, because you got guys like Tony Elliott, right? You got guys like Pete Golding's a guy at Alabama. There's some guys out there that people mention all the time as potential assistants coming in for big head coaching jobs, making that step. And I've always felt, wait a minute, Jimmy Lake, where's he? Why aren't we having that conversation? Yeah. It was very quiet. I didn't hear much about it. My sense is, and you alluded to this in your Wilner Hotline, mercurynews.com, a story here recently, this may have been in the works for quite some time.
Yeah, he has turned down some jobs, but I think part of it too is, everything about Washington is a little bit off the beaten track, right? I mean, it's just so far from the hub of college football, from the media hub, from the recruiting hub, from everything. And so it's a little bit easier for an assistant coach or coordinator in Seattle to kind of avoid, getting into that cauldron of speculation. But I also think that he made it pretty clear that he was happy at Washington, and he only really listened a few times to some of the the biggest jobs, like for instance Alabama. So my sense is that Peterson probably knew last winter that he was coming to the end and needing a break. Now I don't know if he would have told Lake, I'm leaving next December, or it may be 2 years. But I have to think that there was some kind of, wink, wink. You stick around. We're going to have you coach in waiting, and whether it's a year or two, you're gonna be the guy.
So let's I want you to bottom line this. So Peterson completely voluntarily is leaving Washington. That's what this is.
That's my understanding. I haven't. I'm always skeptical about these kind of things. Mm-hmm. There could be something else going on personally or whatever. But certainly based on what's out there now, there's no reason to believe. And also, if you just think about kind of what he's like as a person and his priorities,
that's the key.
Yeah, there's not a reason to think that there's something ulterior going on.
I think that I do think it's different in the Stoops Riley thing. Actually, I think it's very different. This is an opinion, this is speculation, but Peterson comes off to me as more of kind of a paternal personality, like Dabo. I think Dabo kind of has that paternal thing going, not just with the players, but also with his coaches. And I think that might be a little bit of what is at work with the staff of Peterson, that this is, and like you said before, it's different. It's different in a lot of ways, and you're able to do that off the beaten path. Peterson's able to have that kind of a situation and do things undercover. So it's different because I think Stoops was more kind of nudged a little bit by Castiglione. That's my sense. But I don't think that's the case here. And so
I don't either.
It's really fascinating to see what's going on in Seattle because that's a huge program. I don't want to call it a sleeping giant, but I grew up in the days of Don James.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised at some point if they get back to that top 5 team every single year. Yeah. And speaking, very similar situation, if not more so at USC, what's going on there? So what are you hearing about what's happening at SC?
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it. You're not hearing anything, and that could mean something, right? I mean, if they wanted to bring Clay Helton back, wouldn't they have just come out and said it already? Right. So I don't know. I think, that Seinfeld episode when George finally decides to go against every one of his instincts and that he gets the attractive girl at the bar, introduces her. With USC, they need to go against every instinct in their fiber, in my opinion, and make a change and hire from the outside. And there's just nobody knows what's going to happen. I agree with you. I don't think Urban Meyer is going to happen to at SC. I talked to somebody recently who knows Meyer and was pretty skeptical. And I think that there could be hesitancy on both sides, his side of going to USC, their side of hiring him. It feels like it's not going to happen. But I don't know. They may not make a change. It's very possible. You can't guess along with them.
What's the deal with Mike Bohn? Is there, he's Cincinnati, right?
Yep.
Ohio, but he's been a lot of places.
Yep.
He's been to the Pac-12. I mean, what's your read on Bohn and his role in this and what all that means that they hired him?
Well, I think that they hired him because they needed somebody who did not have ties to USC. It was very clear they needed new blood. He's got experience in the Pac-12. He's very good with media, with messaging,
already
interacting. Absolutely. And they needed a front-facing leader of that department. They needed somebody who was going to get the message out that they want out because the headlines have been so bad for so long there. So in those regards, I think he was a smart hire. His hiring record is a little bit mixed, right? He made a mistake with Dan Hawkins, who was at Colorado. Made a mess
at Colorado.
Yeah, made a mistake with John Embry. I think the Mike McIntyre hire, I think you could argue he got that right. McIntyre won a division there. He certainly got Luke Fickell right. He hired Tad Boyle, the best coach in Colorado basketball history. So
you got UCLA, Mick Cronin.
Yeah.
Or is Mick Cronin Xavier, or is he UC? Did I get that wrong?
He was at Cincinnati.
Okay.
I don't believe
I should know that.
I don't
we
think
should
Mike
know that.
hired him at Cincinnati, but he hired Cronin's replacement from Northern Kentucky. So the hiring record is mixed. You kind of have to assume he's going to learn from previous mistakes on that regard. But I think that Bohn is sharp, and I also think that this is really his call. The president has made it clear that the boosters and trustees need to stay out, and she's running the show, and she's turned the show over to Mike Bohn. So the two of them are going to get it figured out, and they both like Clay Helton, but they both realize that there's a lot of reasons to make a change. I mean, if they don't make a change, Coliseum's going to be half empty next year.
I want you to lay that out because from my perspective, when you have, to me, the donors and the whale donors, as I call them, and the guys, and of course at SC, that means the chairman of the board of trustees, Rick Caruso.
Yep.
And you have some people, and they used to have the board with 800 board members on the board of trustees at SC, which facilitated that. And that's why Al Cowling's name is on a dormitory right now at SC.
Yep.
But the one thing I'll say, and I want to ask you about the money and the buyout, because you have you're the one guy that I think really is explaining why it's not that big of a deal. But my thought on Carol Folt is, if you really want to understand how powerful she is, the new rules with the Board of Trustees, the age limit rule with the Board of Trustees, limiting the number, that is huge.
Yeah.
That is a shot across the bow. That's also an acknowledgement from guys, the billionaire, Rick Caruso, who sticks his nose in everything, that she's in charge, she's the sheriff. But explain some of your angle on why that buyout, the $20 million buyout from Helton needs to really be put in context.
Well, I think that 20 million, I'm not sure it is quite 20 million. When you include Helton's compensation and what it would cost to change out the staff, my sense is it's probably closer to 15. Either way, the empty seats at the Coliseum are costing them a ton of money. Sam Darnold's last year, they averaged about 72,000. This year was right about mid 50s. If you calculate the number of empty seats by the amount of money spent by a paying customer, $100 say per butt in the seat, times what turns out to be almost 100,000 empty seats compared to 2017, they're losing 10 million a year in game day cash. They're losing the connection that you make on game day with fans that can buy merchandise and become future season ticket holders and become current and future donors and suite holders. So they are losing a ton in ticket sales and game day experience every year Helton is there. I mean, the numbers show it, right? It's gone from 72,000 down to 55, 57,000, and it could get worse next year if they bring him back. That is a ton of money. It's basically his buyout every year that they have in the cost of the empty seats.
What about the recruiting angle? I've held, and you've seen the rankings. I mean, my sense is any chance that Helton had to come back, the recruiting class that they're looking at in 2 weeks of trying to get signed is as bad. I've been covering USC. I was on the broadcast. I used to do a show at Petros on their flagship staff. This is the worst recruiting situation I've ever seen. Is that a factor here?
You would think it's a factor. You would think that I don't know that Carol Folt is paying much attention to the rankings. I'm sure she's heard about it, but you'd have to think Mike Bone is very attuned to that situation. And it's not just that they are, using scholarships on a bunch of 3-star players. It's that the 5-star kid who lives a mile from the Coliseum is going to Clemson or Alabama. Right. And the kids from Bosco and Mater Dei, they're
unbelievable.
Their pipeline, and they're just leaving. They're going to Oregon too. I mean, let's face it, Pac-12 schools are benefiting too, and that's another calculation for USC. You want to do what everybody else wants you to do, which is keep Clay Helton, or do you want to do what your competitors don't want you to do?
Right,
make a change, right? I mean, Mario Cristobal would be thrilled if they kept Clay Helton for another year, because they're going to lose this recruiting class that's signing this winter, and they're also going to fall way behind with the juniors, and they're going to fall behind with the sophomores.
Yeah. And you think about the alumni players that they have at SC, and you never really see them all that. Keyshawn Johnson does a morning show on ESPN radio. He should be the number one promoter of that program. And I'm not so sure he wouldn't want to be if he could. But there's so much potential here.
So much.
And it's mind-boggling.
Yep.
So
and then you look at LSU last week, right? Ed Orgeron, who spoke to LSU's team last week?
Oh my God.
Allen. Marcus Allen is speaking to Ed Orgeron's team at LSU. And if you're a USC fan, if you're a former Trojan player, if you're a donor, that is like a knife in your heart, and they've got to do something about that. It's only going to get worse.
Let me just tell you this, and I know this from sources, and God, there's so much to talk. I got one more question for you. But when you mentioned, I'm so glad you brought that up, because when it comes to alumni football players at SC, the two most influential guys who have Carol Folt's ear, what I'm told is it's Marcus Allen and Rodney Peete. And if any former players are going to have any input at all in what's going on in the coaching situation, those two guys, right? Contemporary players, contemporaneous. For Marcus Allen to be talking to Ed Ogeron's team, you said it. Let me just put a punctuation mark on what you times a million tells you where the prominent alumni for SC, where they are with Clay Helton, and the message that sends, I think, and it's sending to. I mean, I don't even. I'm speechless that you that you told us that. That's unbelievable. And of course, the whole point is they had Ed Ogeron there. They had him with Pete Carroll. They could have had him as the coach with the interim, and they decided to go in a different direction. Now, in USC's defense, LSU was going to hire Tom Herman if they could over Ed Ogeron. He was the compromise pick. So now I want to ask you, I wish I could ask you a million questions. Two more questions. Let's do Stanford. What happened this year with David Shaw on that team?
Well, it's not one thing, right? You go from winning, you go from winning 8, 9, 10 games.
This is a great program.
It's not one thing. I think that they certainly got wiped out by injuries. Right. I mean, offensive line, a lot of places.
Quarterback
left with a ton of freshmen. Quarterback. The schedule was brutal, especially early. Right. SC, UCF's back to back, then Oregon, all in September. Brutal schedule, a lot of injuries. I also think that they're a little bit stale on offense. They seem a little bit predictable. It seems like everybody knows what they're doing. And certainly the talent's not there, right? They don't have, first of all, they don't have that, elite running back. They certainly don't have the number of quality tight ends that they used to, so they can, have threats with 2 on the field or 3 on the field at once. The offensive line, there's 1 or 2 guys that look like elite players, but it's not like it was. And the biggest difference to me is on the front 7 on defense. They used to have maulers, right? And they just smother you. They don't have those guys anymore. Their secondary line, the talent in the secondary has overall increased, I think, compared to say 5-7 years ago, but they don't have the players on the front 7, so they can't just physically overwhelm teams. So I think it's everything. And does David Shaw need to think about refreshing his coaching staff? Yeah, he probably does need to think about it. And the playbook, yeah. And they need to,
wow.
do about recruiting.
You just dropped a bomb on him.
Yeah, I mean, I just think they need to tweak
Yeah.
things, right? I mean, you do the same thing over and over and you're successful. But when you are a head coach and you get to year 6, 7, 8, it's harder and harder to sustain that success. And you got to stay fresh. And it's hard to know when you have to stay fresh.
Well, it's a unique situation because we're having this conversation and nobody is talking about him getting fired because it's a unique situation. And I've talked to many people about it and I've asked them, what's going on? Is there anything happening? And they're like, no. David Shaw runs that school, Now, if they have a 1-11 season back to back, that's different. But that's probably not going to happen. But what's interesting to me is when you look at Stanford, when we're talking about recruiting, good Lord, it's a tough place to recruit to no matter what. So it's so critical to be able to be great at evaluating talent coming in and more specifically, the ability to develop talent.
Yeah.
And so that tells me, I think your point about being stale with Stanford, you're never really going to go to the college football playoff, maybe once in 25, 30 years, if you're lucky. So knowing that you're really not going to get there, right? So what are we doing here? We're trying to be really good, but that's a recipe, I think, for complacency. And when you know you're not going to get fired, you're in a good position, as David Shaw is, and you make a couple of bad assistant hires or you lose guys, that could be catastrophic to the program. So my sense is that the coaching staff probably, as much as anything, when you talk about the talent level, I always look at Stanford, John, but you're up there. You're much closer to it than I am. But I've always looked at them as saying, wow, they could really develop those guys. How do they play so well? It wasn't so much that they had a lot of talent. I'm going to ask you this question. Do you think that Stanford, the function of Stanford's success, extraordinary success, really unprecedented over the last 15 years, has it really been a function of talent, better recruiting, or do you think it's been a function of the coaching staff?
I mean, I got to tell you, I think it's everything. I think it starts with actually, it starts above the coaching. To be honest, it starts with former athletic director Bob Bowlesby, who convinced the university they needed to invest in football. And so they built housing for assistant coaches so they could retain their coaches. They increased the salary pool. They worked on their facilities. They expanded their resources within the football office to help them find more recruits, right? Because for them, they got to recruit nationally. So it started with Bob Bowlesby's kind of blueprint. And then you hire Harbaugh and you hire Shaw and you hire Vic Fangio and Greg Roman and you get things rolling. And they're an interesting situation with recruiting. They have a much smaller pool of recruitable athletes than most others, almost pretty much every school in the Power Five, except, maybe Northwestern, Vanderbilt. But they can get a high percentage of the kids that they can recruit, right? That's their thing.
Right.
If Stanford's offering you a scholarship, they got a hell of a chance to get you no matter who the competition is, because the parents want the kids to go there.
Dude, that's a transformational situation. You know? It really is. I mean, Northwestern, it is to an extent. Stanford is in that category with the Ivies. Yeah. I mean, that's my sense.
Well, and the campus is gorgeous, and the weather. There's so much going for them, but they can't miss as their margin for error is a little bit smaller. But they did a great job from maybe 2008 to 2012, finding guys that could play their system. Guys that ended up getting drafted. And a lot of them were offensive linemen, defensive linemen, and linebackers. And that's what they built. And tight ends, right? That's what they built. And fullbacks, right? That's an underappreciated situation for them. They haven't had an elite fullback in a few years, and that hurts their running game.
That's fullback U in the Pac-12.
It is. It's tight end U. It's fullback U, and they should always have a good quarterback. So you've got the building blocks, but they just don't have the talent on defense up front, and they certainly got wiped out by injuries. If you say the injuries were maybe give them 2 losses, then they're 6-6, and 6-6 it's hard to avoid being 6-6 once every decade.
Yeah, we got to let you go, unfortunately, but man, I can't thank you enough, and thanks for the intel on Stanford, because now it's starting to make much more sense. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
And, I really appreciate it. We'll have you back soon. Thank you, John.
Thanks a ton, Brooks. Really appreciate it.
That's John Wilner, Wilner Hotline on Twitter, mercurynews.com. Subscribe. Great intel from John Wilner on programs, college football coaching situations in the Pac-12. Now we're going to travel down in Florida, and we're going to get the scoop on what to me is a big deal, the Florida State coaching situation with a guy who's been on the show before, Tashawn Reed, friend of the show, right? From The Athletic. Yeah. How you doing, Tashawn?
Good, man. How are you?
I'm doing great. And so what's the latest on the Florida State coaching situation?
I guess this morning, the latest thing, Tallahassee Democrat reported that, an announcement likely isn't coming until the weekend. Yesterday, there was a lot of, I guess, social media news, I'll call it. People, snapping photos of Doak Campbell Stadium being painted, and there being a press conference room set up at the Champions Club at the stadium, which is the booster section. So it's pretty apparent that something's coming soon. But based off that Democrat report, no official public word is going to come until this weekend. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't know who their guy is or that they can't, agree to terms before then, but it's not going to come out until this weekend, apparently.
I got so many questions for you about, because I want to know what your impressions. I mean, what's the impression right now from everybody on the level of guy they're gonna hire? Is this going to be an impressive hire? Is it isn't? Is the administration clueless? Is there other things, dynamics in play that aren't being reported? I mean, what are your thoughts?
I think at this point we can rule out most of the flashy names that I guess you could call, a big hire, quote unquote. Bob Stoops, he's not coming. James Franklin, those kind of guys.
James Franklin, no chance.
No, I don't. Okay. From what I've gathered, is not happening.
That's what I've heard too.
Yeah. And I mean, you don't necessarily have to be a big name to be a good coach, though. I think that's what it comes down to. The most important thing for them isn't getting a boost in ticket sales next year. It's not getting a bunch of credit on social media. It's hiring a coach that they can believe can get the Florida State football program back to what it used to be. And, you know, I think that's the most important thing throughout this. I don't think it's necessarily important where they announce the hire this week or next week, to be honest with you, just because I know the early signing period has changed things a bit. But I mean, at this point, I mean, whoever you hire with less than 2 weeks to work with, I mean, realistically, how many recruits do you really think they're going to pick up for early signing period? You know,
how does that recruiting class look right now for Florida State?
It's still pretty good. I mean, I think it's 18th right now, according to 24/7 was the last time I checked. They have 17 commits. They did have some decommits, but I think it's a pretty damn good class considering they're coming off of 3 straight mediocre seasons and what will this be the second coaching change in 3 seasons. So, I mean, you can't really ask for much more. There's plenty of other programs that have much worse recruiting classes than 18th in the country. And most of the recruits, I mean, there are a lot of them that are, you know, doing their due diligence and listening to other schools, and some have even gone on official visits other places, but they've maintained their commitment. And I think that's more so the importance of whoever the next hire is holding on to what they already have for the early signing period, and then trying to add more when it comes to National Signing Day in February. I think that will be the outlook. And that's why I don't think it necessarily matters. I know everybody's freaking out about what day they announce it this week or next week or whatever, but I mean, it doesn't really matter that much.
I mean, if you're getting the right guy, it doesn't matter because it's a 10-year hire, a 15-year hire. We're visiting with Sean Reed of The Athletic. He covers the Florida State beat. And so it's amazing because last time you were on the show, this was right after Taggart got fired. And I don't think I mentioned this when you were on the show, but I had talked to some very, very good sources. Some of those sources represent potential candidates for coaching jobs, not necessarily for Florida State, but they had told me that the word out on Florida State was that there's a perception out there that race could be part of the equation in what happened with Willie Taggart. And you somewhat addressed, we didn't communicate about it. We didn't talk about it. It was in the back of my mind. I didn't bring it up at the time, but talk a little bit about what your approach has been in that context, because I think you have touched on it a little bit and what your experience has been.
Yeah, I wrote about it the week Willie Taggart got fired. The piece was more so addressing the timing of his firing, but also there was a couple sections in there on race. I broke down how, you know, there's not too many black coaches to begin with. I know Jimmy Lake just got promoted in Washington, but I think even still there's only 13 black head coaches out of 130 spots, which is obviously a very low number considering the number of players.
It's outrageous.
Yeah,
it's unbelievable.
And I think, you know, historically speaking, and I broke this down a bit in the piece, black coaches have gotten a shorter leash, and Willie Taggart pretty much got the shortest leash that we've ever seen at this level, you know, for a coach. I know Chad Morris was fired in the same year, but he got an extra game than Willie Taggart did with a much worse record. And so I think it definitely matters. I wouldn't say that was a driving factor in the reason why he was fired or even the reason why he was hired. I know there was a lot of things with Stan Wilcox, you know, saying that he only hired Willie Taggart because he wanted to have a black head coach and things of that nature, because Stan Wilcox is also, you know, a black athletic director. And so I don't think it's either end of it, you know, in his hire or his fire, it wasn't a determining factor, but I think you'd be, you know, disingenuous to say that it wasn't a factor at all.
Dude, the bottom line is there's no black head coaches, and there never has been. In college football. And college football, it's never been like this more so than it is today, emanates out of the South. You can't get around it. All right. So, and you did it, you know, the way I think it should be done. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And when it's this unprecedented, and when you look at the rhetoric that was out there in the press and the media, of course, there's always fans about the team discipline and the on-field, off-field content. And then you look at the situation surrounding the Arkansas program. I'm not saying they got problems there necessarily, but you didn't hear anything about that. It was just, well, I mean, Morris, that was a catastrophic situation that he had put Arkansas in. Well, how did that? I have no idea what happened there because nobody's talking about it. But God knows they talked about Willie Taggart. All the things that happened to him in a very, very short period of time. Those are facts. So if you can't, go ahead.
With him, you know, the criticisms you would always notice a lot of it had to do with his mental capacity to do the job. He's not smart enough. He has no control over his players. They're undisciplined, they're uncoordinated. And many of the issues that they had under him have continued under Coach Hagan's, but we haven't heard those sort of things about him. I know they're both black men,
right.
You see the difference there. And with other programs like Arkansas, where things were just completely awful, you didn't hear those same things. And I think that's something that is more so, it's not overt that race is a factor in those statements, maybe if you aren't familiar with it, but it's a lot of coded language. A lot of times with black people, no matter what the profession is, their intelligence gets questioned a lot, whether they're fitting for the job, whether they're capable, whether they're worthy. And I think you saw a lot of those criticisms with Willie Taggart. Obviously the results, objectively, they just weren't there. They weren't winning enough games, but the way that he was talked about is just different from his peers.
Yeah. And you just keep going back to the numbers. You keep going back to the unprecedented nature. Now, when it comes to Taggart, you cover the team. Was he good enough to remain as coach of Florida State? Do you think he should have kept his job? Should he have had a long-term opportunity? What are your thoughts on how competent he was with that program?
I think it was too early to tell. I feel like with most coaches, I think that year 3 is when whether this guy is the guy for the job or not. And right. I think, we'll never know, obviously, but I feel like they would have, taken a step ahead that third year, maybe win 8 games. I know that's not the sexiest season or the best season for Florida State to have, but I think that's a step ahead, obviously, from 5-7, a step ahead from 6-6, which they are now. And I think, if he does make that progression next year, then you have to give him that 4th year. And I think what it came down to was, whether it was boosters, whether it was administration, whether it was both, fan base, I just don't think he had enough support and people wanting him to be here for that 4th year, for that 5th year. So I don't think, they really wanted to give him the opportunity to go out there that year 3 and have a good year. And then you have to keep him when you don't really want him. And so I think he really wasn't given enough time to show whether he was the right guy. Obviously, I don't think he made enough progress from year 1 to year 2. Just issues from penalties to late game management to small things like clock management and timeout management to, maybe the recruiting starting to trend downward. I think that would naturally happen anyway with the way their record was, but they had some clear missteps at quarterback. They didn't sign a quarterback under Willie Taggart. On the offensive line, they had some misses. He didn't get enough transfers. So he definitely made plenty of missteps, and maybe the growth from year 1 to year 2 wasn't as great as it should have been. But I think that year 3, he could have, he had a quarterback committed, and he's still committed now. I think obviously the offense was starting to turn a corner. Maybe there would have been some shuffling along the defensive staff, which we've seen now after Willie Taggart got fired, Jim Levitt being promoted, Mario Edwards being promoted, and things of that nature. So I just think it was too early to tell. I think that year 3 he could have shown that he had the potential to be the guy and start to turn the program around, but I guess we'll just never know.
So, we've heard about the buyout situation, how it was this colossal buyout and all that. Mm-hmm. But now, come to find out, at least I'm seeing reports about him not signing his contract. He literally didn't physically sign. What's the story? What's going on with that?
He had there's something that I noticed because I requested all the coaches' contracts, and his was the only one that was a memorandum and not an actual contract. Wow. He did sign it though. I can see his signature on the document that I had. So that's false. He signed it, but the school hadn't signed it. But that doesn't really change anything. They're still bound to that because he signed it, and so there's no way they can really.
So it's much ado.
Yeah, and he can. What I believe, I don't think they will ultimately pay that full $17 million. I think what they'll do is maybe come to a lesser agreement with an immediate payout. That would probably make more sense for both sides, especially if Taggart wants to go work somewhere else, instead of maybe having, the buyout subtracted every year based on the salary at his new job. Maybe he just takes a lump sum, just throwing out a number, let's say $10 million or something like that, to where it saves the school $7 million, and then he gets the money immediately and doesn't have it kind of taken off of his new salary if he does decide to work again this year, which we'll have to wait and see. I know he's, being kind of thrown in the mix just kind of naturally there with the USF opening, but nothing firm has developed from that so far. But I do think that they will settle most likely at a lesser amount than the $17 million figure that we've been seeing.
So in terms of candidates, any read on who we might see as being named as the next head coach at Florida State?
I think if going back to that Democrat report, I think if that is true, I think just naturally them waiting until the weekend signals that it's somebody who's coaching in a championship game this weekend. Otherwise, why would you wait? It wouldn't really gain anything from waiting. And so there's a short list of people who are coaching in those games, obviously. I think the most notable names that come to mind are, Mike Norvell at Memphis, Matt Rule with Baylor, Luke Fickell with Cincinnati, and then you have several coordinators, most notably the 3 Clemson coordinators that are coaching in the game. So I guess hypothetically speaking, those people would seem more likely than maybe somebody who isn't coaching in the game. Otherwise, if it wasn't somebody that was coaching this weekend, why, like I said, why would you wait? And so I
got one name for you. Lane Kiffin.
Oh God.
Is there any possibility? Is there any possibility? All right. Okay. I know. Your reaction is my reaction.
Yeah.
But that would be, so let's say they hired Lane Kiffin. What would the response be? Do you think people would like that hire at Florida State, the fan base, or would they go crazy? I'm just throwing it out there.
They go crazy. I think everybody would go crazy.
So Norvell sounds like the guy that, amongst the fans and amongst people around Tallahassee and Florida State, who do they want realistically? Who's the guy?
Of those candidates I just named, Norvell seems like the one people will want the most. He's probably the most successful as a proven head coach. He's the most successful of the guys coaching this weekend. Obviously, the Clemson coordinators have won national championships, but they aren't proven. I guess they aren't known commodities. Nobody really is, especially when you're talking about moving from Group of 5 to Power 5. Mm-hmm. But I think people are pretty high on Mike Norvell in general. He'd be relatively cheap. His buyout's only $500,000. His salary, I think, at Memphis is around $2.5 million or so. And so they really wouldn't have to, get into a bidding war like they would with maybe, let's say a Mark Stoops at Kentucky or, whoever you want to name that's at a Power 5 job already. Obviously, it's much easier to get a Group of 5 coach. And so I think financially, he'd probably be one of the cheaper options. He's also proven to be a damn good coach. I know a lot of people kind of say he inherited Justin Fuente's team, but I think we see how Fuente's doing at Virginia Tech. So I think you have to give Norvell some credit there. Obviously, he'd be an outsider to the Florida area. I mean, most of the guys that they're considering would be, besides maybe Tony Elliott at Clemson. But it seems like they're more so leaning towards an established head coach. And I think of the group of established head coaches coaching this weekend that are available, he probably makes the most sense.
Sean, thanks so much, man. I know it's a crazy time. It's the craziest time of the year. I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, man.
That's Deshaun Reed, and he's one more reason why you get The Athletic. You subscribe to The Athletic, and we just had John Wilner on, of course, from Wilner Hotline on Twitter and MercuryNews.com. He's the reason that you subscribe to MercuryNews.com. If you're a college football fan, here's the thing. If you're watching this show, I would assume you are, because nobody's paying me to do anything in terms of promoting, The Athletic or MercuryNews.com. I'm just telling you what to do. And I am telling you what to do because that's where you're going to get great information. I mean, Wilner right there early in the show spelled out a lot of things, particularly the buyout at SC, the buyout, where everybody says, oh, my God, they can't. I've literally heard a lot of pundits out there, college football pundits. And granted, we all kind of know they don't know anything, but some of them do. But they're proffering this $20 million buyout. I can't, I know you heard this. If you watch the big networks, particularly ESPN, I know you've heard people say, if they can't get an Urban Meyer or maybe a James Franklin, there's no way USC should pay Clay Helton $20 million not to coach. I've heard that a lot. And every time I hear it, after I switch the channel, I think to myself, okay, you've got billionaires, 2 major billionaires on the board of trustees. All right. They put Al Cowling's, one of them put Al Cowling's name on a brand new dormitory, but they can't afford a $20 million buyout, a buyout that they negotiated themselves, knew exactly what they were doing when they did it. They can afford it. But forget about that. John Wilner, who we had on earlier, brings up the point, and I don't know if I drove it home enough. SC fans know this. When you have empty seats at the Coliseum, that's a big deal. And that's a lot of money. A lot of money. And when you have donors who just redid the Coliseum, and who have this sycophantic, and they do. It's like I grew up in a Notre Dame house. My dad, my brother, my cousin went to Notre Dame, and there's this eternal idea in people's minds that at Notre Dame they should be a national championship contender and nothing less. Well, it's the same mentality at SC. SC's a little bit disconnected from the rest of the country. I went to school at Georgia, lived on the East Coast for many years, lived in the South, covered all of that. I was at Ohio State, covered that, right, in the media, did the pre and post. Then I came out to Los Angeles and covered SC, and I can tell you it's the same. But the people in the rest of the country aren't really aware of how deep it is, and it's deep. It's no different. The culture at USC amongst the prominent alumni, the football alumni, and the fans, right? They look at their program. I'm just telling you right now because I'm living here. I've been here for 18 years, and I've been on their broadcasts. I've taken their calls on the talk shows. And, of course, we talked all about USC yesterday, right? They look at the program at USC and think we should be doing what Ohio State is doing right now. And guess what? They're right. They're right. They are right. They should be. They should be. At the very least, they should be in the conversation, SC, every year to be in the college football playoff. Every single year. Because, you know, west of the Mississippi, whatever, there's no program, you know, in the western part of the country that has more tradition, more resources, more everything. It's an embarrassment of freaking riches. It's ridiculous. And you have a guy in Clay Helton who has a Sun Belt Conference mentality. I'm not the first person to say that. A guy I used to do a show with, Petros Papadakis, who was a former USC football player, captain. His whole family played football at Notre Dame. I'm sure I should say USC. His father would kill me, John, if he heard me say that. But he's a local radio host and does stuff for Fox, does color and sidelines. And he's the guy that's always invoking Clay Helton's resume that, you know, he came from the Sun Belt Conference and that's what he represents. But, you know, it's the truth. And, you know, to hear people talk about the 20, that's why you watch this show. Because if you watch this show, the first thing you learn is, and this is nothing against ESPN or FS1 or the pundits or Feinbaum, who's probably the most prominent of these people. If you watch those folks to try to find out what's going on with your favorite team or just the sport, what's going to happen, that's actually the last place you should be looking. That's the last place. You should be coming here. You should be reading John Wilner. You should be following Tashawn Reed, who, by the way, Tashawn Reed on Twitter has got one of the best Twitter feeds out there. Florida State fans, if you're watching, there are probably some of you out there, might not, it's Tashawn, Tashan Reed, all one word. The Athletic covers Florida State. He's kind of an outsider guy. He's not from that area. So that's good, you know, because he's obviously informed. But I'm glad that he brought up the unprecedented nature of Taggart's firing and the tiny thimble, you know, size. You could fit the number of African-American college football coaches on the head of a pin. It's outrageous. And it doesn't matter if you don't even have to bring up that it's racist. Just give people the numbers and then give them the unprecedented, ridiculous nature of the firing of Willie Taggart. Compare it to what's going on with Tom Herman right now. That's not lost on a lot of people. And so, but what I was saying to Deshaun, I want to reiterate this. I want to repeat it because I don't think I've said it on the show, maybe once. I have talked to a lot of sources who represent coaches or have a connection to coaches who are in play for jobs every year, right? And I've had more than one of those sources tell me flat out, I didn't say this to Sean, but they have told me flat out that Florida State was not going to hire a black coach after Willie Taggart. they're not going to hire a black coach, and that black coaches head coach candidates don't want to go to Florida State. And when they've said that to me, like everybody who's white, I guess, right? I've been like, whoa, what? What are you talking about? They don't. Well, Wilcox is gone, the AD. Taggart is gone, and Taggart is gone in this ridiculously unprecedented situation. I'm not saying it's racist. I push back on those guys, and they have said to me, it doesn't really matter what we think. It's what we're hearing from those guys. That's what matters. And they've got pretty good grounds for detecting that race could be a problem, could be an issue. Number one, with the numbers and the nature of Taggart's firing. Number two, the past. The past. Florida State, right? Deep South, not just the Deep South, Southwest Florida, the Panhandle. Do you know how hard it is to get to Tallahassee? It's like the State College, Pennsylvania of the South. Do you know how far Tallahassee is from a big city, and what you have to do to get to that big city? Now, I think it's either Atlanta or Tampa or, I don't know, Jacksonville, something, not really a big city. Well, they've got an NFL team. But if you just want to go from Tampa or Orlando to Tallahassee, how much time you got, right? So it's an isolated place. I don't want to go into the history. Someday we've got to do that. Not that we're applying it to now, but we are. I want to give you an example of a couple of Florida State tidbits. All right. That I know you don't know. And these are just cursory things. And from my study of college football history, and that would be, I remember I was researching a story from the 1950s. This is like in the mid 50s. It's like 1954, 1955. And it was about another story about another player, an African-American football player named Johnny Bright at Drake, who was a Heisman Trophy candidate at the time. This is before Ernie Davis. This is like 10 years before Ernie Davis. All right. So it's early to mid 50s. I have to pin down the date. But in the process of studying that story, Drake played in the same conference with Bradley in football. And those two schools used to have big time football programs, believe it or not. And Bradley, at the time I was studying the story, was playing Florida State. And this is in the 50s. And Bradley, and this came out in the newspaper. This was a national story. This was America in the 1950s. And me growing up as a guy in Kansas City from the suburbs, went to Georgia, had all these experiences that you probably know about if you watch the show. This is the stuff that hits you like a bolt of lightning. And it really hits you when you start discovering just how many times it happened and how common it was. It was so common that it wasn't a huge story. It was just reported. And that is that Bradley, during the football season, this is early to mid 50s, it's like 1954, was scheduled to play for Florida State that year. And Bradley had black players, and Florida State refused to play Bradley because they had black players. And so Bradley canceled the game. That was very common. That sort of thing, as ridiculous as it sounds today. And I think if you're an American, you know anything about our past, of course, it's not that ridiculous. It's not that unbelievable. But when you put that in the context of, how do you not know they've got black players, right? Now during this, because it happened during the season. Now during the season, you're going to cancel it? What? So, Michigan, of all those situations that I'm talking about, and that story's from the 1950s, but this really went on beginning, from the very first day that college football, as we know it, started to take place. 1869, you may have heard that this year is the 150th anniversary of college football. First game, the beginning of college at the creation of the game. That's complete bullshit. It's not the 150th anniversary of anything, because Princeton and Rutgers in that fateful first game played soccer. They didn't play what we have today, American football. And the stuff we have today didn't exist until about 1913, because the forward pass didn't exist at all until 1906. There was no forward pass until 1906. It was essentially rugby, pretty much. But what we did here as Americans, Walter Camp did, when you wonder, I'll give you one quick tidbit that's going to blow people away when you tell them this about football and how American football happened. Why did it happen? Where did it come from? It's sad. I mean, ESPN's doing this big 150 thing, and still nobody knows. Why do we call it football? Why do we call this soccer? How'd the game happen? All that crap, right? This is not a digression. It's important. Just because you don't know and nobody knows except for me doesn't mean it's not important. Football's huge. It's the center of our culture. You can't escape it. What's the origin of it? That's kind of important. It is to me. History is extremely important to know where you came from. That's the context. That's everything. That's what governs what we do in the future and the legitimacy of what we're doing now. So where did it come from? It came from one guy named Walter Camp in the 1880s who was playing rugby for Yale. Everybody played rugby, right? And he decided one day, I really don't like rugby, because in rugby, you can have the ball. Your team can have the ball the whole game. If you know anything about rugby, possession of the ball is based on that scrum where everybody comes together, boom, right? And then the official throws the ball underneath everybody, and whoever gets the ball out of that has possession. Their team has possession of the ball, and it's pretty much random. It's not random. I mean, I'm sure guys are really skilled at it, but you could not have to. They could score against your team in rugby 2 or 3 times in a row, and you still can't get the ball. So this guy, his name's Walter Camp, was a rugby player at Yale, came up with an idea to standardize the possession of the game. This is the origin of football, period. American football, period. He took the word scrum. If you know anything about rugby, you know they call it a scrummage. It's a scrummage, and scrummage is when they put the ball underneath the scrum and determine possession. So that's called a scrum. All right. And it's moving around all the time and all over the field. Well, this guy, Walter Camp, changed the word scrummage to scrimmage and made it a static point on the field where we set the ball, right? And we alternate possessions based on whether you scored or you got 3 chances to make 5 yards or 5 chances to make 10 yards. Eventually, it ends up 3 chances to make 10 yards in 1906. Okay? But football was all effed up. It was a freaking awful. I mean, it's boring enough sometimes right now, right? You watch Mississippi State play. Yikes. But so that's what happened. Some guy at Yale changed the word scrummage to scrimmage and took rugby and the randomness of how they possess the ball, the teams, and changed it to scrimmage, set up a line where everybody got to alternate possessions after you scored, or if you didn't make a certain amount of yards in a certain number of tries, well, the ball goes to the other team. The other big part of football, and the reason it's called football, again, this is a huge thing that nobody knows. So what the hell? Why is it called football? How can we have, you can't swing a dead cat without seeing a documentary on football right now because of all of what because of ESPN Plus, SEC Network, ACC, Longhorn, dude, half of their programming is documentaries about the history of football. Yet, there's nobody in this country that can tell you, why do we call our national game, our national pastime, football? Why do we call it football when the rest of the world, defines that as something else? What? What is that? And we call what they're doing soccer. I have the answer. I know the answer. I will say this. I know the answer from my research and putting it together. Something that you're not going to read in a book. You're not going to read in a dissertation. People don't know. Even the scholars, all the historians, all the people making documentaries. Maybe I should make one about why it's called football. I'm about to tell you why. Number one, Walter Camp, same guy, because Walter Camp is the guy. He's the oracle. He's the guy that sat down in his dorm room at Yale and wrote the rules out and then promoted the F out of it at Yale and helped Yale on a student level. The students did this, engaged Harvard, engaged Princeton, Columbia, and they set up this organization in which these schools would play on a regular basis. That was a big part of this because that had never really existed. Even in rugby, it hadn't yet existed. That was a big part of how football, began to happen as we know it, right? So this is freaking great stuff, man. So then why is it called football? Why did Walter Camp call it football and didn't change the name? One of the reasons is at the advent, if you know rugby, you got to understand rugby. Kicking is extremely important in rugby. Much more important, of course, than it is in our game. But in the conversion from rugby to football, in the beginning, you had, first of all, the ball, which was essentially a basketball size thing. You know what a rugby thing is. But even back then, the rugby ball was different. It was essentially a kickball. What we understand is, kickball that you played in 5th grade. That was the ball they had back then. So kicking was crucial to what was going on, even in Walter Camp's converted, adjusted football game, right? And he wanted to differentiate from rugby, call it something else. So what are we going to call it? Well, we're going to call it football because kicking is so important in the game. Of course, it's not as important now. It's still important. Ask Matt Luke, right? Ask Elijah Moore of Ole Miss. It's still crucial. Ask Adam Vinatieri and the Patriots and all kinds of stuff we could throw out there about kicking. Ask Pat McAfee, who has a career because of kicking. But the game itself, kicking was integral to football up until about 1906. That's when everything changed in football. And then in 1913, the forward pass, which began in 1906, but it was ridiculous the way they instituted it, because if you tried it and let's say you try to pass after 1906 and this is all college football. There's no pro football at that time. Football was college football. If you try to throw a pass in 1906 and it was incomplete, turnover, you lose possession of the ball. So why would you, unless you're desperate. But in 1913, that changed. So let's go back though. So they call it football. Camp does, not they. Walter Camp calls it football. He's the guy that sat down there and wrote it down. Calls it football because they're kicking like they do in rugby up until about 1906. Now, this takes place in the late 1870s, early 1880s. And at the time, still, why do we still call it football when the whole world calls what we call soccer football? So why has it maintained that name all these years? It makes no sense unless you're Walter Camp and you're living back then at the time when it comes to how the British referred to what they just call football today. At the time, Walter Camp was doing his thing for Yale, right? Redoing rugby into this more standardized game with the possessions and all of that stuff, glorified rugby, but it was more predictable with the possessions. At the time he was doing all that stuff, writing the original rules for American football and giving it a different name for rugby. Kicking was more important to the game, but also at the time, the British called football, their football, soccer, like we do today. Football and soccer to the British before 1900 was referred to as both football and soccer. They were interchangeable. They aren't today. Nobody in England calls what they call football soccer. Where did soccer come from? That word. Well, when you think about the original soccer governing body, it was called the Football Association, and it was based in England. And they got the word soccer from association. But after 1900, the British saw that all these Americans are calling it, they're all calling it soccer, so we're going to stop calling it soccer. And so now they just call it football. But before, they called it soccer too. And that's why we have football as our game today. Because the British didn't want to call it the same thing we called what we were doing. That's the answer. Now, I just told you where we got football for American football. Speaking of American football, let's go out and talk to Dan Orlovsky, rising star, exploding on the scene in football media this year. Social media is everywhere. Dan Orlovsky, if you watch this show, needs no introduction. How you doing, Dan?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Jesus, I'm doing great. You're not on television. I mean, talk about your schedule, dude. What is your schedule like?
Yeah, my schedule is busy. Just by the week, considering college football season just got done, but it's heavy. I mean, starting on a Sunday, I will watch all the games. Starting at 1:00, and I'll have 4 or 5 monitors up, or screens, or televisions, or something, and I'll watch all the games through certainly the afternoon and into the evening. And Sunday Night Football, I'll get up at 4:00 in the morning, head into New York. I'll get up for while I'm in the car heading to New York. I'll rewatch.
How long is that commute?
About an hour for me.
Okay, keep going.
I'll rewatch 3 or 4 games in the car, and then I'll rewatch.
Wow.
Production meetings. Yeah, just trying to find stuff, and I'll get up and first take, and then I'll be home about noon. I get home, do a quick workout, and about 1:00, I'll start watching tape again, and I'll watch tape till about 3:30. Kids get home from school. I spend a little bit of 30, 40 minutes with them. I'll watch tape for another hour, and then I will do that again. I'll watch Monday Night Football. Tuesday's the same as Wednesday. Tuesday afternoon, I will start watching college tape at like 6:00 at night. Wednesday, I'm in from like 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Thursday is a heavy college football day, prep for games, travel on Friday, meetings, coaches, all that stuff. I do game on Saturday, get home Saturday night, and start all over again.
Unbelievable, man. We're definitely going to talk some football here, but I, like everybody else, see you on television, and it's not that you've come out of nowhere. You haven't. I mean, we've known you since you played in the NFL, but talk a little bit about how you got to ESPN. How did this thing happen the way it's happened? Just your career exploding the way it has.
Yeah, social media, to be honest with you, man. Like,
really?
Yeah, I got done playing in 17, really training camp early September of 17. And I knew I was going to go into like television or coaching. I always wanted to do television. I like talking. I like, trying to educate people. I like arguing, debating. And so kind of knew I wanted to go into that. And it was like October. I knew, okay, no network is going to come knocking on my door, give me a job. So it was a Sunday Night Football game. It was the Panthers and the Dolphins. It was later in the fourth quarter, good game, and Carolina had 3rd down. And they're in their formation, and Miami starts to show all-out blitz. Cam sees it, changes the play at the line of scrimmage, wide receiver screen touchdown. No one on the broadcast is talking about it. And I'm like, that was really cool. Like, people should know why that happened, not just what happened, but why. And so my wife was like, make a video, put it on the internet. And at that time I had 1,000 Twitter followers, and I don't even know if I was on Instagram type thing. And I was like, that's stupid. Social media is stupid. Ignorance, right? And so
right.
about 3
That's
minutes
the problem. You're here to educate, right?
Yeah. About 3 minutes later, I was like, all right, I'll try it. Muted the television, took my phone, held it up to the television, and with the remote control, just recorded the video and told everybody what was happening. Posted it, went to bed. Woke up the next morning, bang, went viral. And I was like, that's my end. That's the way for me to be different. And so started doing more and more of that stuff, posting it on Twitter. People were craving it and loving it. And then I really got lucky. Peter Schrager for Fox and NFL Network hit me up and was like, hey, would you come on our show and do this? And
wow.
Yeah,
wow.
big time, right? And so I was like, I'd be honored. So I started doing that, and I was on television, and people started to see it, and kind of went from there. And a couple of networks came calling type thing, and here I am.
What's interesting about you, I've worked with Kirk Herbstreit, and I was with Kirk Herbstreit doing his weekday talk show. He used to do a general talk show for years in Columbus, and I co-hosted that show with him for about 3.5 years. And, this is Kirk Herbstreit, played college football, was a good player. You played, and you're a very good player in college and in the NFL. You were in the NFL for a long time. But it doesn't mean that you're a big name. And Herbstreit wasn't a big name either coming out. And at a very young age, made his breaks in some ways the way you have. But the thing about Herbie, and we just had him on the show, actually, and he talked about this 2-3 weeks ago. When you look at his success, people just say, oh, it's the look, and he's there, and he's doing his thing. His whole success, his whole point is, dude, I don't have a name. I don't have that pedigree that everybody knows in a football context. I've got to work my ass off.
Yeah.
So I'm never letting down on the air. And so I'm always ahead of the game. And if you watch his analysis during games, it's freaking pretty damn good.
Yeah.
And what really speaks to me, and I think what you just kind of described, your schedule, but my perception of you is similar to him. You have kind of similar backgrounds, but the thing that's really striking about you, I know I'm filibustering and Brooks is doing all the talking, sorry, but I'm watching your Twitter feed the other day, and I know you do this a lot, and you're doing analysis on like a video, a Periscope, and you've got like your ballpoint pen,
Yeah.
and you're like showing people this stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, this guy's big time. This guy's doing the telestrator, this $1 trillion telestrator, right? You've got all this incredible technology, but he's got the damn ballpoint. He just can't help himself. He can't stop because it truly is your life. You truly are the bona fide, authentic, genuine article. And you talk about rewatching games, and it kind of reminds me, you telling these stories and now linking that up with what you just told me to Kirk. And so, that's my observation. And that's why I'm so fascinated in talking to guys like you who, you've been a great athlete, but man, how did you get to this transcendent point so early in your career? It's because you freaking earned it, and you continue to earn it every single day. So I think people don't realize that. They just, he has an agent, he got a break, and you need that too, but you put yourself into that position. So now when you're looking, I want to ask you about the telestrator stuff, right? When you go to ESPN and I see you push the buttons and all that stuff, how long does it take to get used to that stuff? Take us through that process, that stuff that you use at ESPN.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, it came relatively natural to me because I had kind of done so much stuff on my own with the ballpoint pen or my finger or whatnot. I just use
literally.
It. Yeah, it's a different utensil that I use. I think that what was gone on is you figure out how to refine it and make it clear and understandable and succinct. And so it takes I keep it simple as well. There's a lot of things that you can choose as tools on your kind of your palette on those iPads or Microsoft Surfaces. I keep it simple, man. Like I don't need all the bells and whistles. That's why I still on my Twitter, people sometimes be like, man, you can get this software for your house. I go, no, I don't need it. Like I want people to see what I'm talking about. Like I don't need so I keep it simple. It didn't take a long time for me.
Did you have a training session, or do you have to go in and say, hey, I want to use this, or how does that work?
Yeah, I had the beginnings of a training session. Like they called me in to do some stuff, and they were like, "This is how it works." And I was like, "Yeah, I got it." And they were like, "Well, you practice before going on television." I said, "I feel like I'm pretty confident in this." And they were like, "Well, we carved out 3 hours of a training session. This is in Bristol." And I was like, "All right, here, just give me a play." And they put up a play, and I was like, "All right, I'm going to do this like it's live television." And we did it, and they were like, "All right, you're good." And so. They try to, ESPN is great. They try to get you to go, hey, we have this, this, and this. And I tell them, like, right now, I don't want it. Right now, I want to be clear and I want to be finite and succinct. But it just came relatively natural to me, kind of because I grew up doing it in a quarterback room. I was up on a board doing it on, a big white draw board or something, draw whiteboard.
So we're visiting with Dan Orlovsky of ESPN, former NFL college football player. So why are you not coaching? I'm not saying you shouldn't be doing this. I love you're doing this. I want you to do it. But why? How did you not end up in coaching?
It's a great question. First of all, thank you. I'll also thank you for the words in relation with Herbie. To be honest with you, man, I've played for a long time, and I saw a lot of downsides to coaching. I'm married. I've got 4 kids.
Right.
My wife and my family will always be the most important thing to me. So when it came to like which life or which workforce was going to allow me to keep that paramount, I'm not saying coaches can't. I've seen coaches have incredible family life and have incredible success coaching. They're just a rarity. And the norm is you're moving 7 times in 10 years and your kids are in 1,000 different schools. And I mean, if I had to, I would. And I always think I will. Like, I think eventually that will be an option. But I look at television as coaching. Like, I just think instead of coaching 50 or 60 people, I'm fortunate to coach a couple 100,000 in the morning so I look at them very similar, but really the home life, I wanted this afforded it for me.
When you look at particularly the college coaches, you've been doing college analysis, college game analysis. What thoughts go through your mind when you go to Mississippi State and meet with those coaches? Is that part of the thought process you just talked about?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I have such profound appreciation and respect for these college coaches, man. Like, there's a lot of positives and benefits to their jobs. I mean, there's incredible amounts. There's also some challenges and some struggles. In college, the culture or the expectation of college sports nowadays is if you didn't win a national title yesterday, you're on the clock. So, I think that is a daunting task in recruiting and social media and all that stuff. But I'm always fascinated by how committed they are to kind of seeing the big picture. And to be honest with you, man, like, you can tell the difference real quickly. You spend 10 minutes with the head coach, you can see what coach really values, what the kid's going to look like in 2050. What is he going to become as a human and being able to be good at football. And you can quickly tell some coaches who don't get it, who don't grab you, who don't kind of convict you, who don't kind of run the room.
My impression of like the transcendent college coach, the Urban Meyer and the Nick Saban, what separates them? Is it scheming? Is it the assistant coaching? Is it recruiting? What is it that separates, as you look at those guys, them to that transcendent level?
I think those guys do an outstanding job. Like, okay, talent matters. Yes, they can go get players. I think they separate themselves by how they develop those players. What those players are like when they first step on campus and what those players are like.
Is that prioritizing the assistant coaches, or is it those guys?
I think it's prioritizing your assistant coaches and who those assistant coaches are, what you allow them to do, how much you micromanage. There's a fine line, right? Micromanaging and no stone unturned to every detail gets attended to. I think where those coaches are matters. Like, where's the talent? That's a big deal. I also think, especially nowadays, like, these guys are doing a really good job of figuring out the people and what of that. I'm a player, and I need a lot of bad coaches. I say not bad coaches. A lot of coaches set the standard or expectation level and go, get here, get here, work harder. Mm-hmm. Really great coaches know I need different tools to get here. You need different tools to get here. Like, we all need different tools. We are not cookie cutter players. You can't just do the same thing for every 18, 19, or 20-year-old. I need different stuff. Great coaches, Urban Meyers and Nick Sabans and Dabos, and those guys understand what each guy needs to get to their expectation or standard level.
So we're visiting with Dan Orlovsky of ESPN, longtime NFL player, great college quarterback. So speaking of social media, sometimes you get blowback. Sometimes I get it a lot. And one of the things that I did a while ago was I put up a picture of Bill Belichick and right next to Nick Saban. And I know they know each other and they coach with each other and they're kind of similar, but I labeled them. There's Bill Belichick right next to Nick Saban. And I said, underneath Belichick, great coach. And underneath Saban, I wrote, great recruiter. Right. And my point about this is my opinion. I see to you on the coaching stuff. You're there, boots on the ground. But my impression of why Alabama and Clemson and now Ohio State under Meyer, and of days adding to that, but primarily under Urban Meyer, is what separates them is just the overall level of talent. And they're 3 deep at those positions. And it's not so much the finer points of on-field coaching, which is or on field during the game, because if you look at somebody like Saban, he has astonishing turnover in his coaching staff at the highest level of his coaching staff. What do you think about the guy like me who says, no, it's all talent, Dan. It's not really the finer points of coaching in college that separates those coaches?
Well, I would say 2 things. I think that it's hard to sit here and say it's not. I mean, that Alabama's a dynasty. Like, it can't just – there's other talented kids that were going to other schools. We've also seen programs get a ton of 4- or 5-star guys and not become really good. Like, Ohio State in the last 3 years has gotten 69 4- or 5-star recruits. They've sent 18 of them in the first or second round to the NFL. Michigan's got 71 4- or 5-star recruits. They've sent 4.
Wait. So Michigan had more 4- and 5-star recruits over that time period?
And they sent
really
less guys to go in the first or second round. So
wow.
Yeah. So Ohio State had 18 become first or second round draft picks. Michigan had 4. So, like, yes, the talent acquisition is massive. But to become the dynasty that Alabama became, coaching was the difference. And the coaching from day one to the end, how successful, their run of draft picks have been at Alabama. So I do think that the talent acquisition in college is the number one determining factor. Or not number one, but like, poof. It is a big deal, and I would agree that Belichick has become the greatest coach at any level ever.
What is it about? The floor is yours. I'm not going to keep you all day, just a few more minutes, but the floor is yours. Tell me about Belichick. Why is he this transcendent guy in the NFL?
Belichick was always 18 months ahead of everybody. Everybody. Whether it was how to play, what you were good at, what you weren't good at, what the styles were going to be with the rules,
right?
How to manage the clocks.
Right.
I mean, he was always 18 months ahead of everybody with everything. And I think that the greatest thing that Belichick ever did was he never boxed guys into a position. 10 years ago, 12 years ago was about his defense, or 15 years ago was about his defense, and he had all these defensive guys that they could rush the passer, but then they could go and play in coverage, and then big physical corners that sometimes would play safety, and blitzing linebackers that were big as defensive ends. Like, no one prepared for that. You couldn't match up personnel-wise with that. And nowadays, in the last 5 or 6 years, I've always said this. I don't think the Patriots have had running backs, and I don't think the Patriots have had wide receivers. They've had football players. Wes Welker ran for 1,000 yards. Yeah. Rex Burkhead had 80 catches from the slot. Yeah. He just took all these football players and said, "Oh, this game's going to space. We're gonna play with space and have all these different guys that benefit us for matchups and whatnot." You couldn't match up. He was always ahead personnel because he thought ahead.
That's amazing. So now tell me about Tom Brady. What are you seeing on the field for Tom Brady, and why do you think? I think it was after the Eagles game. They're 9-1, and he's all pissed off. So assess Tom Brady's situation.
Yeah, I mean, today Tom Brady right now is, I mean, he's playing like a 36-year-old quarterback, but he's 42, right? I mean, a lot of people are pointing the finger and going, Tom Brady's terrible right now. No, 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 no. I think that the reason he reacted to that post Philly is he knows. He knows. Like, he knows this is the closest he's ever been to the end. This is the worst he's ever been
So it was
playing.
about himself. That's what that was about.
In totality, though, like Tom's aware enough to know that what's around him is in direct correlation to or has direct impact on his production. He knows that this is the worst support staff he's ever had offensively. And so I would imagine you're 42, this is your last run, you're not under contract next year, there's a lot of rumors, and you want to go out and win one more, and you know your team is good enough as long as your offense doesn't mess it up. And there's a reason why Tom Brady offered for Antonio Brown to come stay at his house. He knew back in August that he was going to need he needed someone, and so the standard and expectation was this guy's the greatest of all time. But watching them play, he's got no trust. I keep going back to that word. He's got no I don't think Josh McDaniels has trust in what they can do or who they can turn to outside of Brady and Edelman. And Brady as a quarterback doesn't have trust in what they can do or who they can turn to. That is a paralyzing feeling as a quarterback.
So my big thing, and we've had a bunch of guys from New England, major Boston media guys come on the show, cover the Pats beat. And my sense is that when he went off after that particular situation that was so stark and people had never really seen it, came off as selfish, is that to me it was kind of a passive aggressive lash out at Belichick. And you mentioned it earlier, this is his worst supporting cast. You could certainly make that argument on offense. Maybe, just maybe, after Belichick had come on to the press conference dais with the big Cheshire cat grin because they had just had a great defensive performance, right, in beating the Eagles at the time, here comes Brady. And in my sense, it was Brady kind of lashing out at Belichick, indirectly saying, hey, where are my damn players? Am I off?
I mean, I think everyone's aware of it. I think Tom's very aware of what's around him.
But the effort that Belichick is making, is he making the effort, or is it just a coincidence that they've got this bad supporting cast that guys haven't panned out?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a coincidence. Like, again, they signed AB. That didn't work. They had Josh Gordon. I don't know why they got rid of him. I don't know if they were anticipating Gronk retiring when he did. So those are three pretty big players. I think that Tom is very aware of what's around him. I think Bill Belichick's very aware. Those guys have gotten through so much that I can't imagine, that they haven't had butted heads in the past. But I don't know if it was a lashing out. Tom said yesterday, we got to have realistic expectations on offense. This is the guy who's had unrealistic expectations since he was at Michigan, right? I mean, he's bigger than anyone else and has accomplished that. He wants to play till he's 45. Tom, that's unrealistic, but not to Tom Brady. So for him to say, we have to have realistic expectations, that tells me everything I need to know about the reality of their offense.
Two quick things, just two random things I want to ask you. Sam Darnold, remember when he had those 2 games in a row where he literally looked like he forgot how to play football? Remember that? Where it was a total disaster. And at the time, Dan, I had a lot of people on this show screaming at me that he's done and it's because of Gase. So you tell me now, because I want to hear your assessment of him. What you think?
Everyone who asks me that, I go, give me one starter on the Jets outside of Le'Veon Bell that would start on the top 15 teams in the league.
Yeah.
You won't find one. So what do you expect of him? Like, he's going to be a special player. I believe he's got it up here. He's talented beyond his mind, his words. They have a very bad football team. And so there's signs of highs because he's such a talented player. And then there's signs of lows. I think, this isn't a totality thing, but there's this myth out there that every really good quarterback makes everybody around him a great player. Really good quarterbacks make bad players decent, make decent players pretty good, make pretty good players good to really – but the reality of where the NFL is right now, because, again, of rules and space and coaching, quarterbacks are made better by the people around them rather than quarterbacks making the people around them better. That's the NFL nowadays. 15 years ago, that was a different conversation.
Interesting.
But you look at all the quarterbacks that are playing really good right now, and I'm going to find you. And this is really going back to the Eagles Super Bowl 2 years ago. The Eagles made the Patriots defense because the Eagles had 6 really good players that they could throw the football to, and the Patriots couldn't match up. That's why Nick Foles played so well. Quarterbacks are now being elevated by what's around them rather than elevating the people that are there.
Wow, that's interesting. So last thing, Lamar Jackson. People are confused. The media is confused. They are. Is he a transcendent quarterback, or is he a guy who, just because of his legs right now, happens to be a decent passer, but it's more a function of that he's a great athlete? Long term, where is this guy in 5 years?
It's a great question. He's a transcendent player. I got asked this today. Is Lamar Jackson going to change the future of the NFL? One, we don't know because we don't even know if it's a success yet. In truth, we don't know if it's a success. They've had a great regular season. Lamar's been ridiculous. He's the MVP. We don't know if it's going to culminate in a Super Bowl. And we've never seen something like this culminate in the Super Bowl. And as rare as this has been, we don't have a lot of organizations that are willing to, from top to bottom, go all in and buy all in like the Ravens did. They had a general manager buy all in on it. They had a head coach buy all in on it. They had an offensive coordinator buy all in on it. So where is he going to be in 5 years? I don't know, because we have empirical data, because he is taking more hits. Now, the hits aren't brutal, but we have empirical data of Cam Newton and Andrew Luck going, I can't take it anymore. And their career is getting shortened.
How good would he be if he was running more along the lines of a Watson or maybe a Wilson? How good would Jackson be if that was the case?
Average. He'd be above average player. Not nearly as impactful and special as he's been. I've said this since the season started. Lamar's been ridiculous. The difference in that football team is there are 3 tight ends. No other team in the league has 3 tight ends that you can put on the field at the same time that can all run block and all be a part of the pass game like Baltimore. It's like playing with 8 offensive linemen. No one goes back to Bill Belichick in New England. No one in the NFL can match up with it. They don't have the personnel.
Future head football coach at the University of Connecticut. That sounds like a good title, but I'm not going to put you on the spot. That's just what I think. I'm not going to put you on the spot because I'm just going to say, and I've been tempted to say this on Twitter. Between us, all right, just between us, I almost tweeted when I was watching you do analysis, and I sound obsequious and I'm kissing your ass, and I kind of am, but man, you remind me of Tony Romo doing the college game analysis, and I'm thinking, how's this guy not in the NFL? But I know I can't really do that because you're a professional. I don't want to put you on the spot. So let's just leave it at that. Man, I can't thank you enough, and let's do this again sometime. Thank you so much, Dan.
Very kind words. All the people you kind of referenced me to, I appreciate it, man.
I'm serious.
Man. Thank you.
That's Dan Orlovsky. You know him from ESPN, of course. You know him from the Detroit Lions, I'm sure, or his long NFL career and a great quarterback at UConn. You may not know that. University of Connecticut head football coach, offensive coordinator at Rutgers. If I'm Schiano, that's who I'm calling. You may not get a call back, and you probably won't. But it's amazing listening to him. I watched tape, this, that, and the other. I mean, he's in hog heaven in his job. You know what I think of, though, even in his job, I think, how does he deal with family and kids? That's amazing how they do that. Now, when you're talking about coaching, and this really makes sense, what he said about why he's not coaching, he referenced his family. And I believe that if you're going to be a great college coach, I can't really speak to the NFL so much. But I do think there is a difference, and I'll tell you in a second what it is. If you're a college coach, what's changed in college football? Why is Alabama where it is? Why is Ohio State where it is right now? We'll see how long that lasts with Day, because that's Urban Meyer. I mean, there's been a lot of backhands, swipes at Urban Meyer in the last year with this Ohio State team where people have said, where was this? Well, first of all, Justin Fields is amazing. He's a great talent. We'll see how that projects over time, how much he can read defenses and do the subtle part of it. I mean, that's why, dude, Dan's amazing. You can say, what do you think of Darnold? Because a guy like Darnold or Justin Fields or Daniel Jones, I mean, I'm confused because everybody says something different. Here's a guy, if anybody knows what they're talking about, it's him. It's him. And so I'm in hog heaven when I have him on the show, and we're talking about, okay, what is the deal with Brady? What's the final word? What's the situation? How do you assess him? How do you assess Lamar Jackson if he wasn't running? That's what I want to know. And that's what's so great about what he does on Get Up and First Take, and it's why he's always there. And of course, he's a guy who's not afraid to get into it. So as he said before, he loves to argue. But to my point about the transcendent college coaches, to me, I can't imagine how you can have kids and really do what you're supposed to do with your family and your kids and your wife, attend to them, and be a head football coach and get to the college football playoff today, because what separates Saban and Urban Meyer is recruiting, and how recruiting has changed. And we've talked to guys about this, Mike Farrell of Rivals. We talked to Barrett Simmons about this, guys at 24/7, the recruiting guys, right? Keith Niebuhr, of course, we had him on the show talking about this. Those guys, the reason they are where they are, and Clay Helton is where he is, and Gus Malzahn is where he is they truly live at 24/7 in recruiting. That's been the big difference. That's what Urban Meyer revolutionized. Urban Meyer at Florida and Utah revolutionized the head coach being the person who was the point man for recruiting 24/7. Yes, he's got his assistants. Yes, there's some assistants that are better than others, like Larry Johnson at Ohio State, who I might add was at Penn State for about 50 years, and nobody brings that up these days. They bring up Schiano as if Larry Johnson didn't know anything, right? But yeah, you hire guys to be great recruiters. And case in point, we talked about T. Martin yesterday during one of my rants about Helton. You know, when T. Martin and Ryan Abraham is a guy, Inside Troy on Twitter, great. We need to have him on from USCFootball.com during this situation with Helton and the coaching staff and where that program is and why it is where it is and what needs to be done. He probably speaks to it better than anybody here in LA, Ryan Abraham. But when I look at somebody like Helton, he's not committed the way Nick Saban is, period. Nick Saban works harder today than Clay Helton does. Period. And when you have a T. Martin on your staff, former Tennessee quarterback, but who's a ace recruiter, and you let him go, which happened last year, or he wants to leave, right? And you're not working as hard as Urban Meyer, you got a big problem. So that's why, I mean, it's so tantalizing if you're USC right now to be able to get an Urban Meyer. And if they didn't have all of the problems that they themselves in the administration and with the trustees, primarily with the people, I mean, you got to remember, SC is a private school. That's really important. There's a big difference between SC in many ways and Ohio State, even UCLA. Not as big a difference, maybe, where it's, where they have a huge advantage or disadvantage from being a private school, but there's a difference. It's a private school. USC doesn't answer to anybody. You can't do an FOIA request and get Clay Helton's phone calls, phone records, whatever. You can't do that because it's a private school. And that was by design. And as I said yesterday, the history of USC dictates why it is the way it is today. It's run by people who give money. They run the school. That's why USC hasn't had an athletic director for as long as I can remember. As long as I've been here, since 2000, they have not had an athletic director. And that's why, even though Mike Bone is important to give people a sense of propriety, and the athletic department is much bigger than football. It's got a lot going on besides football. It's not bigger than football. It exists because of football. I mean, Bone is not there to hire the coach, and he never will be. He never, not at USC, maybe other places. Now, I'm not saying he can't get candidates, or, I mean, he's in the process, and he can be an asset, but it's like Ohio State, another example. Gene Smith, athletic director, been there forever. Guy who's heavily involved with the NCAA, and he's involved in everything. College football playoff committee, the working group that's trying to prevent football players from getting endorsements that the schools wouldn't even have to pay for. Gene Smith, that guy. Gene Smith didn't hire Urban Meyer. He didn't hire Jim Tressel. Les Wexner did. The big donor who's got his name plastered all over Ohio. Les Wexner runs Ohio State and his family. His wife, Abigail, is on the board of trustees at Ohio State. He's on the board of trustees at the Ohio State Medical Center. And it's the Wexner. That's who's making the calls. And that's why you're watching this show on Fancred. Man, we had such an unbelievable show. I actually have breaking news, exclusive stuff that may or may not be time sensitive. And, you know, we had Wilner on at the beginning of the show. John Wilner had him on like 30 minutes. I could have that guy on for 2 hours. I could have Dan on for 2 hours. And then we got you a specific update on the Florida State situation. Let me just weigh in on Florida State, what I'm hearing. I'm hearing today, talking to sources early this morning, multiple, that Norvell is the guy. And if Norvell doesn't happen, it will be Lane Kiffin. I ran that name by to Sean Reed, the beat guy at The Athletic. I could be wrong. I think it's going to be Norvell. If they're let me just tell you why I think Lane Kiffin is in play at Florida State. Somehow is his advocates include Pete Carroll. And Pete Carroll, if you don't know it already, a little bit like Nick Saban, he's got Carroll as his number one advocate still, and that goes a long way. Carroll is like a professional head coach advocate for his former assistants. That's a big thing for Carroll. It used to be bigger, but he's got that in his back pocket. That helps. But what tells me that Kiffin could be in play for Florida State to indicate to people out there, to leak that they're going to have someone to announce at the end of the week. If you know anything about these situations in college football coaching situations, and you're telling us, you're leaking that you're going to have that coach to announce in 5 days, do you understand how many things can go wrong? 1 million things can go wrong. In the case of Memphis, right? You got Norvell there. Well, Fred Smith at FedEx, again, the Les Wexner of Memphis, he might decide, well, I'm just going to give Norvell $100 million. Whatever. Who knows? I don't know. But if they're going to hire Norvell, they might be waiting for the championship game coming up against Cincinnati for Memphis. That's a possibility. Absolutely. I'm just saying, here's my point. My point is that if they're leaking that or saying that, and they're painting the stadium because they're going to do a whole big presentation with the new coach, that tells me they have a backup plan. They have to have a backup plan, and that backup plan will crawl to Tallahassee. And I just described Lane Kiffin. So, and I'm not just pulling that name out. I've heard that from a source today. Not the way I laid it out. I just heard his name is in the mix at Florida State. He's been very, very quiet. And normally he's not. I love Lane Kiffin. I want Lane Kiffin to go to Florida State. So tomorrow, so that's what I'm hearing on Florida State. And I mentioned it to Sean, who we had on. And it turns out, by the way, this thing about Willie Taggart not signing his contract, he's got this $1 trillion buyout figure, and that it put that in jeopardy. And we just talked to Deshaun, who was part of, scoping out, doing the actual detective work on that story. And he told us it was an offer sheet that Taggart signed. So why is it being reported out there that he didn't sign his contract and that could put his buyout in jeopardy? That's bullshit that's out there. It is. Who's doing that? If you're a reporter, I mean, I know who's doing it, but that's another example of the situation with Taggart. I mean, Taggart was fired right after some well-placed criticism, and I mean criticism of him about the culture, about the fighting on the team, about the on-field stuff, and then he gets fired. And like I said before, I've got sources telling me, multiple sources, this is not made up. I had one source tell me, who represents coaches, tell me Florida State is not going to hire a black coach this time around. And I pushed back and said, what? Why? What are you talking about? It's not going to happen. And he said, because black coaches don't want to go there. Not right now. Not at this time. If you look at the small number of African-American coaches in relation to all the programs, it's always been this way. You've got a program in the panhandle of Florida. All right. And so I heard this a while ago. And when Deshaun came on, of course, Deshaun's African-American. I didn't bring it up. I didn't want to go there because God knows that stuff can blow up, right? Or who knows? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's no big deal. But I didn't bring it up because I hadn't talked to him about it in advance. And I hadn't seen anything in his reporting or his timeline on Twitter where, there was any indication of that there might be something there, something to that. And then about 2 weeks later, Deshaun came out with a very measured story about sources and things, but statistics about the small number of black coaches as head coaches in college football, and then also how unprecedented Taggart's firing was in terms of giving him no time, zero time. So it's almost impossible to conclude that was zero part of the equation, and of course, it goes without saying that I'm not saying that anybody with Florida State, forget about the administration. They're not part of it. It's all the boosters at Florida State. They run everything like everywhere else. I'm not saying any of those prominent boosters who shall remain nameless are dyed-in-the-wool racists or walk around with hoods, right? Or even have a predilection to racism. But it's so endemic in our culture. It remains so endemic in some ways. And our history is so long when it comes to race. And that history is so long, not because of black people, but because of white people. When people talk about black people being obsessed with race, all right? Well, we're talking about 300 years or in that neighborhood. And who is the reason for that? To last that long on that scale, which is unprecedented in human history, slavery, and then segregation, right? If anybody was obsessed with race, it was white people for hundreds of years. So you can excuse black people, I think, if they are a little concerned and they bring these things up, which Deshaun did in a very measured way, and he got pushback on Twitter. We have to run. I could go on forever. I appreciate it. I've got more stuff tomorrow about the Auburn job you haven't heard. And I can't remember. I've got some other things. Oh, the Washington job. I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow. So be here, 9:00 Pacific, noon Eastern time. Great guest. Thanks to Cam Smith, our producer in Boston. From LA, this is Brooks Melchior. So long. This has been Sports by Brooks on Fancred.